Before Egypt rose from the sands, before the pyramids touched the sky, there existed another world, a civilization so ancient it was erased from history and preserved only in myth. Ancient traditions speak of a time when knowledge was unified and humanity was guided by those who remembered an earlier age. A great catastrophe ended that world, leaving behind only fragments of memory. Among those memories stands Thoth, not merely as a god, but as a witness, a keeper of knowledge from a civilization that existed before history itself began. This forgotten world was not loud with armies or kings shouting their names into eternity. It was quiet, balanced, and strangely humorous. Its people believed wisdom was best whispered in silence, and that laughter was the greatest shield against pride. They built temples aligned with stars, not to impress outsiders, but to remind themselves that the cosmos was always watching. Their rituals were playful. Their scholars debated cosmic law with the seriousness of philosophers, but the wit of jesters, and their rulers were remembered not for wars, but for their ability to nap with cosmic punctuality. Thoth remembered their libraries, vast halls filled with scrolls, so detailed they could put even the most energetic youth to sleep. Histories described not battles, but the proper way to sweep a floor so dust aligned with harmony. Scholars adored these texts, though readers often drifted into dreams halfway through. Perhaps that was the point. Wisdom was best absorbed in sleep. The people of this world celebrated boredom as an art form. Festivals were devoted to telling the dullest stories imaginable. Genealogies of goats, the growth of grass, the waiting of water to boil. The duller the tale, the louder the laughter, for they believed that boredom was the highest form of entertainment. Children were trained to recite endless lists, while elders competed to describe the weather in the most monotonous tone possible. It was a civilization that celebrated sleepiness, and perhaps that is why it vanished. It simply dozed off into history. Yet beneath the humor was brilliance. They understood energies that flowed through the earth, vibrations that shaped reality, and cycles of time that bound existence. They knew that pride was dangerous, greed a disease, and collapse inevitable when balance was ignored. Their wisdom survived not in monuments, but in myths, rituals, and silence. Thoth, eternal scribe, preserved their memory. He knew that history begins too late, that humanity insists on writing only after noise has been made. But this first civilization was quiet, humorous, sleepy, and wise. It left no monuments taller than mountains, no armies marching across deserts, no kings demanding worship. It left only silence, laughter, and fragments of wisdom hidden in myth. If you love mythology and history from all cultures and forbidden ancient stories, subscribe, because this channel reveals the secrets behind every myth. And let me know from where you're watching, whether it's from the comfort of your bed, the couch, or secretly at work, pretending to be busy, while actually learning about ancient civilizations. When scholars speak of history, they often begin with the invention of writing. Clay tablets, carved stones, papyrus scrolls. These are treated as the official starting line of civilization. Yet Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, knew this was a convenient fiction. Writing is not the birth of wisdom. It is merely one way of preserving it. Long before the first symbols were scratched into clay, humanity had already lived through ages of brilliance, collapse, and rebirth. The first civilization before Egypt thrived without the need for written records. Its people aligned temples with stars, tracked the cycles of time, and understood the laws of vibration. They passed knowledge through ritual, myth, and silence. They did not need scrolls to remember. They carried wisdom in their stories, their laughter, and their balance with the cosmos. Yet because they left no libraries for archaeologists to uncover, history pretends they never existed. Thoth smiled at the irony. Humanity insists that what is written is what is real, yet the greatest truths are often unwritten. Myths of floods, golden ages, and gods walking among men are dismissed as fantasy, though they are echoes of forgotten worlds. Rituals that survived collapse are treated as superstition, though they are fragments of cosmic law. Symbols carved into stone are called decoration, though they are keys to wisdom. What history ignores is silence. It ignores civilizations that thrived without noise, that lived in balance without needing to shout their greatness. It ignores the wisdom preserved in myth, the truths hidden in ritual, the memory carried by Thoth himself. History begins too late, because humanity prefers drama to quiet, monuments to whispers, kings to comedians. And so, the first civilization before Egypt remains forgotten, erased not by floods or fire, but by the impatience of history itself. Thoth remembered, though humanity did not. He knew that silence is the true guardian of wisdom, and that the absence of writing does not mean the absence of greatness. Myths are often dismissed as fantasy, yet Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, knew they were the most reliable carriers of memory. When civilizations collapsed, when floods swallowed cities and deserts buried temples, the truths of those worlds did not vanish entirely. They survived in stories, disguised as legends of gods, heroes, and catastrophes. Across cultures, myths whisper of an earlier age. The Greeks spoke of a golden time when gods walked among mortals. The Mesopotamians told of floods that reset humanity, echoing the memory of cataclysm. The Hindus preserved tales of vast cycles of ages, each rising and falling like breaths of eternity. Even in the Americas, stories of sky beings and lost lands carried fragments of forgotten worlds. These myths were not inventions of imagination. They were distorted memories of civilizations erased by time. Thoth smiled at the irony. Scholars often treat myths as superstition, yet within them lie the keys to history too old for writing. The story of Atlantis, for example, is not merely a tale of pride punished by the gods, but a memory of a world undone by imbalance. Flood myths told across continents are not coincidences, but echoes of a catastrophe so vast it reshaped humanity. Legends of gods teaching mortals are not fantasies, but recollections of sages who guided survivors after collapse. The first civilization before Egypt understood that wisdom must be preserved in allegory. They cloaked truths in stories, so that even when memory faded, fragments would endure. Myths became the bridge between ages, carrying knowledge across centuries, protecting it from corruption, and disguising it so only seekers with patience and humility could rediscover its meaning. And so, myths speak of an earlier age, not to entertain, but to remind. They are whispers of forgotten worlds, fragments of wisdom hidden in story, waiting for humanity to listen. Thoth, eternal witness, preserved them all, ensuring that even when civilizations vanished, their voices survived in myth. Thoth is often remembered in Egyptian tradition as the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, and measurement. Yet, in the memory of worlds older than Egypt, he was far more than a deity carved into stone. Thoth was the witness, the keeper of memory, the scribe who recorded truths too vast for mortals to hold. He was not worshipped for power, but honored for patience, for his ability to preserve fragments of wisdom when civilizations collapsed into silence. In the first world, before Egypt, Thoth walked not as a distant god, but as a teacher. He guided seekers through riddles, laughter, and silence, reminding them that wisdom was not about conquest, but about balance. He taught that pride was dangerous, that greed was a disease, and that civilizations fall when they forget to laugh at themselves. His lessons were not shouted in temples, but whispered in myths, encoded in symbols, and hidden in rituals that carried meaning across centuries. Thoth's role was unique. While other gods were remembered for thunder, war, or fertility, Thoth was remembered for memory itself. He was the bridge between ages, ensuring that truths survived even when monuments crumbled and libraries burned. He preserved knowledge from before the flood, carried it into Egypt, and disguised it in hieroglyphs and myths so that only seekers with humility could rediscover it. To call Thoth merely a god is to miss his essence. He was the eternal scribe, the cosmic librarian, the guardian of silence. He did not demand worship or obedience. He demanded curiosity, patience, and the willingness to listen. His presence was not about fear, but about remembrance. He reminded humanity that wisdom is never truly lost. It lingers in silence, waiting for those who are ready. And so Thoth stands not as a figure of mythology alone, but as a witness to forgotten worlds. He is more than a god. He is memory itself, the keeper of knowledge from civilizations erased by time, ensuring that humanity will one day awaken to truths older than history. Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, carried within him the memory of a world erased by time. This civilization, older than Egypt, older than the first written word, thrived in silence and balance. It left no scrolls for archaeologists to uncover, no monuments shouting its greatness, only fragments hidden in myth, ritual, and symbol. Yet Thoth remembered, for memory was his gift, and he knew that wisdom must survive, even when empires collapse. The memory of this lost civilization was not preserved in libraries or archives, but in whispers. Survivors carried fragments across deserts and seas, embedding them in stories of gods, floods, and golden ages. Rituals preserved forms long after their meaning was forgotten. Symbols carved into stone carried truths disguised as decoration, and myths disguised cosmic law as tales of heroes and divine beings. These fragments were seeds, planted deliberately so that wisdom could endure collapse. Thoth smiled at the persistence of memory. Even when floods swallowed cities and deserts buried temples, fragments survived. Egypt inherited them, weaving cosmic truths into hieroglyphs, rituals, and myths. Other cultures carried echoes in their legends, their ceremonies, their stories told around fires. The memory of the lost civilization was scattered, but it was never destroyed. To Thoth, memory was not about preserving every detail. It was about ensuring that the essence of wisdom endured. Pride, greed, and imbalance led civilizations to collapse, but silence carried their lessons forward. Myths reminded humanity of floods and golden ages. Rituals preserved cosmic harmony, and symbols whispered truths to seekers who were ready to listen. And so, the memory of the lost civilization lives on, not in monuments or scrolls, but in silence, myth, and ritual. Thoth, eternal witness, preserved it all, ensuring that even when history begins too late, humanity can still awaken to the truths of worlds forgotten. Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, remembered a time when humanity possessed knowledge so profound it seemed to touch the very fabric of reality. This was the wisdom of the first civilization, a world that thrived long before Egypt, long before the pyramids rose from the sands. Their sciences were not crude beginnings, but refined understandings of cosmic law, energies, and cycles that modern minds can scarcely imagine. They knew that sound was not merely vibration, but a force that could heal, align, and transform. Temples were built as resonant chambers, where chants and tones restored balance to body and soul. They understood the currents of the earth, the invisible flows of energy beneath mountains and rivers, and they harnessed these forces to power their cities in ways that seemed miraculous. Their architects aligned monuments with stars, not for decoration, but to synchronize human life with the rhythm of the cosmos. This knowledge was not written in scrolls or carved into stone. It was lived, practiced, and passed through ritual. Priests and sages carried it in memory, embedding fragments in myths and symbols so that even if their world collapsed, the essence would survive. They believed wisdom was too powerful to be preserved openly, for in the wrong hands it could enslave rather than liberate. And so much of it was hidden, waiting for seekers with humility to rediscover. Then came the flood, a cataclysm so vast it reset humanity. Oceans rose, cities vanished, temples crumbled, and libraries dissolved into silence. Much of the knowledge was lost, swallowed by waters that erased entire continents. Yet fragments endured. Survivors carried them across lands, whispering stories of gods, floods, and golden ages. Egypt inherited pieces of this wisdom, weaving them into hieroglyphs, rituals, and myths that disguised cosmic truths as tales of Ra, Osiris, and Isis. Thoth preserved it all. He knew that knowledge from before the flood was not destroyed, only hidden. It lingers in myths told across cultures, in ruins aligned with stars, in rituals that echo forgotten sciences. Humanity may dismiss these fragments as superstition, but they are whispers of a wisdom far older than history itself. And so, the knowledge from before the flood remains, waiting patiently in silence. It is not gone, it is guarded, preserved by Thoth, eternal witness, until humanity is ready to awaken to truths older than time. Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, remembered not only the brilliance of the first civilization, but also the reasons for its fall. It was not erased by chance alone. Nature played its part. Yes, floods rose, earthquakes shook the earth, fires consumed cities, but deeper than these disasters was the imbalance within humanity itself. The people of that world had mastered knowledge beyond imagination. They understood energies that flowed through the earth, the harmony of stars, and the laws of vibration that shaped existence. Yet wisdom, when twisted by pride, becomes dangerous. What began as harmony slowly turned into arrogance. Leaders who once guided with humility began to believe themselves invincible. Knowledge that once healed was turned into tools of domination. The balance that sustained their civilization cracked, and through those cracks, collapse entered. Thoth recalled how greed spread like fire. Resources were hoarded. Temples became monuments to vanity rather than instruments of cosmic law. And laughter Once the shield against pride faded into silence. The people forgot that wisdom was meant to serve balance, not power. They forgot that civilizations thrive not by conquering, but by remembering their place within the rhythm of the cosmos. And so, when cataclysm struck, it was not merely nature's fury, but humanity's forgetfulness that ensured their end. Floods swallowed cities, deserts buried temples, and forests reclaimed shrines. Survivors scattered, carrying fragments of wisdom in myth and ritual. But the great civilization itself vanished, leaving only silence behind. Thoth preserved the memory, knowing that collapse was not the end, but part of the eternal rhythm. Civilizations rise, flourish, forget, and fall. What survives is not pride or monuments, but fragments of wisdom hidden in myth, waiting for seekers to rediscover. The world disappeared because it forgot balance. It vanished because it turned wisdom into vanity. Yet its silence still whispers, reminding humanity that pride destroys, greed blinds, and only humility preserves. Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, remembered the day when silence swallowed the first civilization. It was not a single disaster, but a symphony of cataclysms, floods rising like walls of water, earthquakes splitting the earth, fires consuming cities, and winds so fierce they carried entire forests away. The world trembled, and humanity was forced to begin again. The cataclysm was not random. It was the inevitable rhythm of time, the reset that comes when balance is broken. Pride had grown too strong, greed too widespread, and wisdom too misused. The people of the first civilization believed themselves invincible, yet the cosmos reminded them that no empire is eternal. Their monuments crumbled, their libraries dissolved, and their laughter faded into silence. Thoth watched as survivors scattered across lands, carrying fragments of wisdom in memory, myth, and ritual. They whispered stories of gods punishing pride, of floods cleansing the earth, of golden ages lost to arrogance. These stories became myths, myths became traditions, and traditions became the seeds of new civilizations. Egypt, among others, inherited these fragments, weaving them into rituals and hieroglyphs that disguised cosmic truths as tales of Ra, Osiris, and Isis. The reset of humanity was both tragedy and renewal. It erased pride, silenced vanity, and forced survivors to remember humility. It reminded humanity that wisdom must serve balance, not power, and that civilizations thrive only when they honor silence. The cataclysm was not the end, but the beginning of a new cycle, a chance for humanity to rediscover truths hidden in myth. Thoth preserved the memory, knowing that collapse is part of the eternal rhythm. Civilizations rise, flourish, forget, and fall. What survives is not pride or monuments, but fragments of wisdom carried in silence, waiting for seekers to awaken. And so, the cataclysm reset humanity, erasing arrogance and planting seeds of memory. It was destruction, yes, but also renewal, a reminder that silence is eternal, and that wisdom, though hidden, is never truly lost. Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, remembered that when the cataclysm struck, not all was lost. Though cities crumbled and temples sank beneath waters, there were survivors scattered across mountains, deserts, and islands, carrying fragments of wisdom within them. These survivors became the bridge between the forgotten world and the civilizations that followed. They were not kings or conquerors, but ordinary people who remembered rituals, myths, and symbols. Farmers carried stories of floods. Priests preserved chants that echoed cosmic harmony, and wanderers whispered tales of gods who once walked among mortals. Each survivor held a piece of memory, and together they ensured that fragments of the first civilization endured. Thoth watched as these survivors traveled across lands, embedding their knowledge in new cultures. In Mesopotamia, echoes of flood myths appeared. In India, vast cycles of ages were remembered. In the Americas, stories of sky beings and lost lands were told. Egypt, most of all, inherited fragments of cosmic law, weaving them into hieroglyphs, temples, and myths that disguised wisdom as allegory. The survivors were not always understood. Many were dismissed as storytellers, dreamers, or eccentrics. Yet their tales carried truths too old for writing, truths that would one day guide seekers back to forgotten wisdom. They did not preserve every detail of their world, but they carried its essence, humility, balance, and the reminder that pride leads to collapse. And so, the survivors of the First Age became guardians of memory. They ensured that even when history began too late, fragments of wisdom would endure. Thoth, eternal witness, preserved their stories, knowing that humanity would one day awaken to the whispers carried by those who lived through the end of the first civilization. Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, was not merely a figure carved into temple walls or a name whispered in rituals. He was the embodiment of remembrance itself, the guardian of truths too vast for mortals to hold. When the first civilization collapsed into silence, when floods swallowed cities and deserts buried temples, Thoth carried its memory forward, ensuring that wisdom would not vanish entirely. His role was unique among the divine. While other gods were honored for thunder, fertility, or war, Thoth was honored for patience. He did not wield armies or command storms. He wielded silence and memory. He preserved fragments of knowledge from before the flood, encoding them in symbols, myths, and rituals, so that even when humanity forgot, the essence of wisdom endured. Thoth's memory was not about preserving every detail of the lost world. It was about safeguarding its lessons. He remembered that pride leads to collapse, that greed blinds, and that civilizations thrive only when they honor balance. He remembered the laughter of a people who believed boredom was sacred, the rituals that aligned with cosmic harmony, and the wisdom that taught silence was the greatest teacher. These memories became seeds, scattered across cultures, waiting for seekers to rediscover. Egypt inherited much of this memory. Its priests guarded rituals that echoed older sciences. Its scribes carved hieroglyphs that disguised cosmic truths, and its myths carried fragments of forgotten worlds. Yet Thoth knew that Egypt was not the beginning, but the continuation of a much older story. His presence ensured that the memory of the first civilization lived on, hidden in allegory, waiting for humanity to awaken. And so Thoth stands as the keeper of memory, the eternal witness who bridges ages. He is not merely a god of writing, but the guardian of silence, the protector of wisdom, and the reminder that history begins too late. Through him, the memory of the first civilization endures, whispering across centuries, waiting for those who are ready to listen. Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, remembered how fragments of wisdom from the first civilization did not vanish entirely with the flood. Survivors carried them across lands, embedding truths in rituals, myths, and symbols. Egypt became one of the greatest inheritors of this memory. a land where silence was transformed into hieroglyphs, where cosmic law was disguised as story, and where temples became instruments of forgotten sciences. The transfer of knowledge was not accidental. It was deliberate, guided by sages who knew that wisdom must survive collapse. They cloaked truths in allegory so that only seekers with patience and humility could rediscover them. Rituals preserved cosmic harmony. Hieroglyphs encoded vibrations of sound and energy. And myths told of gods who taught humanity, echoes of sages from the lost world who once walked among mortals. Egypt's temples were not merely places of worship. They were living libraries, aligned with stars, resonating with sound, and built to preserve fragments of cosmic law. Priests became guardians of memory. Scribes became keepers of symbols, and myths became the bridge between ages. The wisdom of the first civilization flowed into Egypt like a river, disguised but enduring. Thoth ensured this transfer. He whispered truths into rituals, encoded memory into hieroglyphs, and preserved silence in myths. He knew that Egypt was not the beginning, but the continuation of a much older story. Its greatness was not born from nothing, but inherited from a world erased by time. And so, Egypt rose not only as a civilization of kings and pyramids, but as a vessel of memory. It carried fragments of wisdom from before the flood, ensuring that even when history begins too late, humanity can still awaken to truths older than time. Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, remembered that when the first civilization collapsed, its wisdom did not vanish entirely. Survivors carried fragments across lands, embedding truths in rituals, myths, and symbols. Egypt became one of the greatest inheritors of this memory, a land where silence was transformed into hieroglyphs, where cosmic law was disguised as story, and where temples became instruments of forgotten sciences. The transfer of knowledge into Egypt was not accidental. It was deliberate, guided by sages who knew that wisdom must survive collapse. They cloaked truths in allegory so that only seekers with patience and humility could rediscover them. Rituals preserved cosmic harmony. Hieroglyphs encoded vibrations of sound and energy. And myths told of gods who taught humanity, echoes of sages from the lost world who once walked among mortals. Egypt's temples were not merely places of worship. They were living libraries, aligned with stars, resonating with sound, and built to preserve fragments of cosmic law. Priests became guardians of memory. Scribes became keepers of symbols, and myths became the bridge between ages. The wisdom of the first civilization flowed into Egypt like a river, disguised but enduring. Thoth ensured this transfer. He whispered truths into rituals, encoded memory into hieroglyphs, and preserved silence in myths. He knew that Egypt was not the beginning, but the continuation of a much older story. Its greatness was not born from nothing, but inherited from a world erased by time. And so, Egypt rose not only as a civilization of kings and pyramids, but as a vessel of memory. It carried fragments of wisdom from before the flood, ensuring that even when history begins too late, humanity can still awaken to truths older than time. Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, remembered the monuments of the first civilization, structures so precise, so aligned with the cosmos, that they seemed to defy the very timelines of history. These were not crude beginnings of architecture, but masterpieces of science and spirit, built with knowledge that modern minds struggle to explain. Temples rose in harmony with the stars, their corridors aligned with solstices and equinoxes, their chambers resonating with sound as if the buildings themselves were instruments. Stones were cut and placed with such precision that even centuries of erosion could not break their symmetry. These structures were not built to impress kings or armies. They were designed to preserve balance, to synchronize human life with cosmic rhythms. Thoth recalled pyramids older than Egypt, monuments buried beneath sands and oceans, and temples whose foundations seemed to predate the civilizations credited with building them. Scholars today call them anomalies, mysteries, or impossibilities, yet they are echoes of a forgotten world. Their existence challenges the timelines of history, reminding humanity that wisdom did not begin with writing, but with silence and alignment. The architecture of the first civilization was more than stone. It was memory carved into earth, vibration encoded in geometry, and cosmic law preserved in design. Each structure was a library without words, a temple without scrolls, a reminder that wisdom can be preserved in form as well as in story. Egypt inherited fragments of this knowledge. Its pyramids, temples, and monuments carry echoes of older sciences, their alignments and proportions whispering truths too old for history. Yet Thoth knew that Egypt was not the origin, but the continuation of a much older tradition. The architecture that defies timelines is proof that civilizations rise, collapse, and rise again, carrying fragments of wisdom across ages. And so, these monuments stand as silent witnesses. They defy timelines not because they are anomalies, but because they are memories of a world erased by time. Thoth preserved their meaning, ensuring that even when scholars dismiss them as mysteries, seekers can still hear their whispers of cosmic law. Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, remembered that in the first civilization before Egypt, the gods were not distant rulers demanding worship, nor were they tyrants commanding obedience. They were teachers, guides, who walked among humanity to preserve balance and pass on wisdom. Their role was not to dominate, but to remind mortals of their place within the rhythm of the cosmos. The gods taught through silence as much as through speech. They showed humanity how to align temples with stars, how to harness sound as a force of healing, and how to live in harmony with the cycles of nature. They did not hand down knowledge in scrolls or decrees. They embedded it in rituals, myths, and symbols so that wisdom would endure even when civilizations collapsed. Their lessons were cloaked in allegory, ensuring that only seekers with patience and humility could rediscover their meaning. Thoth recalled how these divine teachers laughed with humanity, reminding them that pride was dangerous and that laughter was the greatest shield against arrogance. They guided mortals not by fear, but by humor and balance. Festivals celebrated boredom as sacred, rituals aligned with cosmic harmony, and myths disguised truths as stories of gods and heroes. The gods were not worshipped for power, but honored for their patience in teaching. Egypt inherited this tradition. Its myths of Ra, Osiris, Isis, and Horus were not merely tales of divine drama, but echoes of older lessons. They carried fragments of cosmic law, disguised as stories of gods guiding humanity. Priests became guardians of these teachings. Scribes encoded them in hieroglyphs, and temples preserved them in silence. The role of the gods as teachers was to ensure that wisdom survived collapse. They reminded humanity that civilizations rise and fall, but truth endures. They taught that pride destroys, greed blinds, and silence preserves. Thoth, eternal witness, preserved their lessons, ensuring that even when history begins too late, the voice of the gods as teachers still whispers across ages. Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, remembered that the greatest truths of the first civilization were never written down. This was not because the people lacked the ability to record, nor because they were careless with memory. It was deliberate. They understood that writing, while powerful, was fragile. Scrolls burn, libraries collapse, and inscriptions fade. What is written can be destroyed, but what is hidden in myth, ritual, and silence endures. The sages of that world believed wisdom was too sacred to be exposed openly. Knowledge of cosmic law, of energies that flow through the earth, of vibrations that shape reality. These truths could liberate, but they could also enslave if placed in the wrong hands. Writing them plainly would invite misuse, turning harmony into domination. And so, they chose not to write, but to encode. They cloaked wisdom in allegory, disguised truths in symbols, and preserved memory in rituals that seemed ordinary but carried cosmic meaning. Thoth knew that history begins too late because humanity insists on writing only after noise has been made. The first civilization was quiet, balanced, and humorous. It did not shout its greatness with monuments or armies, and it did not carve its wisdom into stone for all to see. Instead, it whispered, trusting that silence would carry memory more faithfully than ink. Egypt inherited fragments of this unwritten wisdom. Hieroglyphs became more than words. They became symbols of vibration. Myths of gods became more than stories. They became coded lessons. Rituals became more than ceremonies. They became living libraries. Yet even Egypt disguised its inheritance, ensuring that only seekers with patience could rediscover the truths hidden within. And so, the history of the first civilization was never written because it was never meant to be. It was preserved in silence, myth, and ritual, waiting for humanity to awaken. Thoth, eternal witness, ensured that even when scrolls burned and monuments crumbled, the essence of wisdom endured, hidden from pride, protected from misuse, and waiting for those who would listen. Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, preserved fragments of wisdom from the first civilization in forms that could survive collapse. Among these fragments were the emerald tablets, mysterious inscriptions said to contain truths too powerful to be revealed openly. They were not simply records of knowledge, they were warnings, reminders that wisdom misused becomes destruction. The emerald tablets spoke of cosmic law, of the cycles of rise and fall, of the balance between light and shadow. They reminded humanity that civilizations thrive when they honor harmony, but collapse when pride and greed take hold. Their words were not meant to dazzle with secrets of power, but to caution against arrogance. They warned that knowledge is a double-edged sword, capable of healing or enslaving, depending on the hands that wield it. Thoth encoded these truths in allegory, ensuring that only seekers with humility could understand. The tablets spoke of the eternal rhythm of time, of civilizations rising and falling like breaths of eternity. They reminded humanity that floods, fires, and cataclysms are not random, but the inevitable consequence of imbalance. They warned that silence preserves wisdom while pride destroys it. Egypt inherited echoes of these warnings. Priests guarded rituals that carried fragments of the tablet's truths, scribes encoded cosmic law in hieroglyphs, and myths disguised lessons as stories of gods guiding humanity. Yet the full meaning remained hidden, waiting for seekers to rediscover. The emerald tablets endure as a reminder that the first civilization did not vanish by accident. It collapsed because wisdom was twisted into vanity, because balance was forgotten, because pride blinded. Their message is clear. Knowledge must be earned, not inherited blindly, and wisdom must serve harmony, not domination. And so, the emerald tablets stand as a warning across ages. They are not simply relics of myth, but echoes of a forgotten world, preserved by Thoth to remind humanity that civilizations rise and fall, but truth endures. Their voice whispers still, honor balance, guard humility, and remember that silence carries the greatest wisdom. Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, observed that the memory of the first civilization has never truly vanished. Though floods erased cities and deserts, buried temples, echoes of that world still resonate in the present. They appear not as monuments or scrolls, but as fragments woven into culture, science, and myth, whispering reminders of truths older than history. These echoes live in the stories humanity continues to tell. Flood myths across continents, tales of golden ages, and legends of gods teaching mortals are not coincidences. They are fragments of memory carried forward. Rituals that seem symbolic often preserve cosmic rhythms. Festivals that celebrate balance echo ancient laughter, and symbols carved into stone still resonate with meanings too old for scholars to fully decode. Modern science, too, stumbles upon these echoes. The study of sound healing recalls the ancient use of vibration as medicine. The rediscovery of energy flows beneath the earth, mirrors the forgotten knowledge of ley lines. Astronomical alignments in monuments remind us that architecture was once a cosmic science, not merely construction. Each discovery is not new, but a reawakening of wisdom humanity once held and lost. Thoth smiled at the persistence of memory. Even in a world dominated by noise, fragments of silence endure. The laughter of the first civilization echoes in humanity's festivals. Their balance whispers in rituals, and their cosmic knowledge lingers in myths disguised as superstition. These echoes remind humanity that wisdom is never destroyed. It is hidden, waiting for seekers to listen. And so, the first world speaks still, not through monuments or scrolls, but through echoes scattered across cultures, sciences, and stories. Thoth, eternal witness, preserved them all, ensuring that even today, humanity can hear the whispers of a civilization erased by time, yet alive in memory. Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, observed that modern civilization, for all its brilliance, has forgotten the essence of wisdom preserved by the first world. Humanity has built towers of steel, machines of speed, and networks of information, yet it has neglected the silence that sustains balance. Knowledge has multiplied, but wisdom has diminished. The first civilization understood that laughter was sacred, that boredom was a shield against pride, and that silence carried truths deeper than words. They knew that sound could heal, that architecture could align with the cosmos, and that rituals preserved harmony between humanity and nature. Modern civilization, in its pursuit of progress, has forgotten these lessons. It has turned knowledge into noise, pride into virtue, and greed into ambition. Thoth remembered how the ancients taught that wisdom must serve balance, not domination. Yet today, knowledge is often wielded as power, used to conquer rather than to harmonize. Technology connects humanity across continents, but it rarely connects humanity to silence. Cities rise higher than pyramids, yet they are rarely aligned with stars. Festivals celebrate distraction, not cosmic rhythm. In forgetting these truths, modern civilization risks repeating the same collapse that erased the first world. What has been forgotten is not merely ritual or myth, but the humility to listen. Humanity has forgotten that silence is eternal, that balance sustains civilizations, and that pride destroys them. It has forgotten that wisdom is not measured in inventions or monuments, but in the ability to live in harmony with the cosmos. And so Thoth preserves the memory, reminding humanity that progress without balance is vanity, and knowledge without wisdom is noise. What modern civilization forgot is what the first world knew, that silence, laughter, and humility are the true foundations of endurance. Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, pondered whether the first civilization was meant to rise again. Its memory lingers in myths, its wisdom echoes in rituals, and its silence whispers across ages. But was this world destined to return, or was it meant only to remind humanity of what was lost? The ancients believed in cycles, ages that rise, flourish, collapse, and return. Just as the sun sets only to rise again, civilizations to follow rhythms of renewal. The flood erased the first world, but fragments of its wisdom survived, carried into Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and beyond. These fragments were not accidents, they were seeds planted deliberately, waiting for humanity to awaken. Thoth knew that return does not mean repetition. The first civilization will not rise again in the same form, with the same temples or rituals. Its return is symbolic, a reawakening of its wisdom in modern times. When humanity rediscovers balance, honors silence, and remembers that pride destroys, the essence of the first world lives again. Its architecture may not be rebuilt, but its truths can be reborn in the hearts of seekers. Yet, Thoth also warned, return is not guaranteed. If humanity continues to forget balance, if knowledge remains noise without wisdom, then collapse will repeat. The first civilization's memory is both promise and warning. It whispers that renewal is possible, but only if humility guides progress. And so was this world meant to return. Not as stone or empire, but as wisdom. Its return is not physical, but spiritual, a reawakening of truths hidden in myth, ritual, and silence. Thoth, eternal witness, preserved them all, ensuring that when humanity is ready, the first world will return not in monuments, but in memory. Thoth, eternal scribe of the gods, remembered the silence that followed the collapse of the first civilization. It was not the silence of peace, nor the silence of rest, but the silence of absence, the quiet that comes when laughter fades, when temples crumble, and when voices that once sang to the stars are swallowed by the earth. The cataclysm had erased cities, drowned libraries, and scattered survivors across lands. What remained was not noise, but stillness. The monuments that once resonated with sound now stood mute beneath the waters, or buried beneath sands. The rituals that once aligned humanity with cosmic harmony were forgotten, replaced by survival. The silence was heavy, yet within it lay memory, fragments waiting to be rediscovered. Thoth knew that silence was not emptiness, it was preservation. In silence, wisdom endured, hidden from pride and greed. The myths whispered by survivors carried echoes of cosmic truths. The rituals, though stripped of meaning, preserved forms that could one day be understood again. Even boredom, once celebrated as sacred, lingered in the quiet rhythms of daily life. Silence became the guardian of memory, ensuring that wisdom was not destroyed, only concealed. Generations passed, and silence carried fragments across time. Egypt rose, inheriting pieces of the lost world. Its temples aligned with stars, its hieroglyphs encoded vibrations, its myths disguised cosmic law. Yet even Egypt did not fully remember. The silence after the first civilization remained, reminding humanity that history begins too late, and that the greatest truths are hidden in what is not spoken. Thoth preserved this silence, knowing it was the most faithful witness. Words can be twisted, monuments can be broken, but silence endures. It whispers to seekers who listen, reminding them that civilizations rise and fall, but truth is eternal. The silence after the first civilization was not an end, but a pause, a breath between worlds, a space where wisdom waits patiently. And so, the silence continues even today. It lingers in myths told across cultures, in rituals performed without full understanding, in monuments that defy timelines. It is the silence of memory, the silence of patience, the silence of Thoth himself, eternal scribe, who guards wisdom until humanity is ready to awaken. Now, as the story drifts into quiet, imagine the hush of the ancient world, temples buried beneath sand, oceans covering forgotten cities, stars shining above ruins unseen. The silence is not empty, it is alive, carrying whispers across ages. It is the silence that waits for you to listen, the silence that holds truths older than time. And with that silence, let the story rest. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the echoes of the first civilization fade into dreams. The wisdom is still there, hidden in silence, waiting for seekers. For now, let it sleep, and let yourself sleep too. Good night.